Welcome to the Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast on YouTube. I hope this episode helps you identify and break your next growth barrier. And if you enjoy it, subscribe to my YouTube channel and you'll never miss a thing. Hey, whether it's staffing, budget, volunteers, or one of the many things that hold back churches, overcoming growth barriers is the key to progress. And if you're ready to break your next barrier, the Art of Leadership Academy is for you. Inside, you'll get access to all my on-demand church leadership courses, team trainings, coaching calls, but more importantly, you'll join a network of 1,500 high-capacity church leaders. Some will be right where you're at and some a little bit ahead, but everybody in the group is committed to leading a healthier, growing church and supporting each other. So if you want to fuel your mission, not just by consuming information, but by pairing it with people who will both challenge and support you, today's the day. You can learn more and start making progress by visiting theartofleadershipacademy.com. And also, check out He Gets Us. Churches across the country are using resources from the He Gets Us campaign to give people new and creative ways to share Jesus' message of radical love. Go to hegetsuspartners.com/Carey and you can sign up to get free resources like discussion guides, prayer guides, reading plans, and more. Now to today's episode. Well, so glad to be with Erwin McManus today, right here in Hollywood. How are you, Erwin?
It's so good to have you here.
Thanks for hosting this too. I really appreciate it. You have been communicating for a long, long time. We're at one of your locations in Hollywood, like literally a block away is the Dolby Theater where they do the Academy Awards. Why Hollywood? Why did you decide you would locate here?
Well, I was 24 years old when I decided to come to LA. And it was before I was married. And I remember telling my wife, Kim, that if we got married, LA was non-negotiable. And I really worked more as a urbanologist and anthropologist, and I liked looking at global trends. And I kind of came to the determination that LA was the epicenter of the future, that the future doesn't emerge equally around the world. There are places in the world that are 1,000 years in the past, or 100 years in the past, or even if you travel across the country, if you go to Indiana, you're going to have a different cultural experience than if you go to San Francisco. And the world just isn't at the same time in history. And I determined when I was 24 that LA was really the epicenter of the future, and I wanted to be wherever the future has been created. So that's why I came here. And then we've moved all over the city. We've been in, the nightclub downtown, the Glam Slam that Prince owned, and then we went to the Mayan, which has like 1,000 pagan gods carved all over it. Iconic place from the movie Collateral, and then we also have a location in South Pass, the Rialto Theater. That's the iconic place for the
Rocky Horror.
Oh yeah, the Rocky Horror Picture Show, and so we've been in a lot of really iconic places. But this spot happened about 12 years ago. And it had been sold. A company in New York bought it, a family, LaFrac family, and it was empty. And they were going to tear it down and put condominiums here. But I knew they were going to go through years and years of litigation. So I flew to New York, walked into Jamie LaFrac's office, and convinced him to lease me the property while they're trying to sell it on a month-to-month. And I had told him, I said, if you'll let me take over this space, we'll make it iconic. It'll be worth more. And so we moved in, and we've been here 12 years on what has been a month-to-month lease.
No way. And you've totally redone the place.
We did.
Right?
We renovated the whole place. You can't touch the outside because the city of Hollywood turned it into a historical property. It's not historical, but they turned it into one to stop them from tearing it down.
Right.
And so we were able to transform the inside. And there was a trend to think across the world where churches were always dark. Everything was black. Everything was gray. And my son, Aaron, said, hey, could you let me redesign the inside? And I told him, I said, I just want one thing, because it was during the pandemic. I want people to come back and know they're going forward, not backwards. I don't want to return to something. I wanted to step into something new. And so he transformed the entire auditorium from all black to this incredibly all white kind of feel, and it's really dynamic, and it's just illuminating. It creates a sense of optimism and hope. It's been really interesting, and I think it's a beginning of a trend I've seen in other places now moving toward all white interiors as well.
Yeah, it is literally like, I don't know, what would you say? Surgical white. Like it's really cool.
It is
the way you've done.
And we felt like Hollywood was the epicenter of creativity, of storytelling, of imagination. And there's sort of an interesting, I think, tension, because if you come to Hollywood, you realize there's not much here.
A lot of tourists.
Yeah, a lot of tourists here. I mean, we're, feet away from the starting of the Stars Walk of Fame. And so Hollywood is more of a metaphor. It's really more of an idea. Hollywood can, happen really in anywhere in the world where they're making a movie, and it's considered Hollywood. But we wanted to be in the epicenter of human creativity, imagination, and storytelling, to say that Jesus is right here at the center. The story of Jesus is the most important story in the world. So I chose this spot strategically and intentionally. And it's been amazing. We've been on the corner of Hollywood Boulevard and La Brea for a dozen years.
Yeah, that's great. And then you've got the Rialto Theater as well, right? Which is another iconic place. I want to talk about communication. So, I mean, I go back to remembering when you took over Church on the Brady. Is that what it was called?
Oh, when we started going, the Church on Brady in East LA.
Before it was Mosaic.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That was, and so it eventually became Mosaic and what it is today. So you've been communicating a long time. How long ago was that?
Yeah. Well, I wanted to go backwards a little bit.
Yeah, let's go.
And because it's an interesting thing when you describe how churches change. When I came to LA, we were in East LA, and we were at a church that was known as the Church on Brady. Its legal name was actually the First Southern Baptist Church of East Los Angeles.
That's a big name.
That's a big name.
So East LA, just put that in context for people who don't know LA. What kind of neighborhood, what kind of demographic is that?
It was on a little side street in between what would be kind of notoriously known as the epicenter of like La M, of like the Mexican mafia, of the world of cholos and gangbangers. And it's the closest, I think, school would be Garfield High School, which is where the movie, I think, was Stand and Deliver was about. And so it's a very Latino, very impoverished kind of area. Mm-hmm. But it's interesting when you say Mosaic became the church, Church Brady became Mosaic. That isn't the way things actually happen in real life.
Tell me what happened.
Yeah, I ended up moving to Los Angeles. My wife and I went to the Church on Brady. They asked me to become the pastor for like a year, and my wife kept saying, "You should never be a pastor." and the former pastor kept asking me to become the pastor. And finally, we decided as a couple, because I didn't come here to be a pastor, and I came here to make concept films and to have an influence in the creative space of the world. And we said, okay, if they vote 100%, then I'll become the pastor. And they voted 100%, but a lot of people didn't vote. I didn't realize that Baptists, can actually just not vote and later vote through their actions. So it went really, really badly. And it was 5 to 6 years of just brutal attempts to transition a church. And it was so stressful. I had a twitch in my right eye for about 5 years. And we started having people come to faith, and the church had been plateaued for 15 years, had been declining for at least 10 years. It had about $1,000 in the bank, $100,000 worth of debt, a deficit, and $1 million worth of debt.
Wow.
And I didn't know any of that when I stepped into it. So we're not talking about communication, but we are talking about the power of transformation and community and transitions. And I learned so much during that season. That's actually why I wrote An Unstoppable Force, because I realized that you're not really transitioning people. You're dealing with a shift of culture. And if you don't understand the power of ethos, you'll never make these changes effectively. And so out of that, what happened was I had to decide, how do I reach LA with people who actually want a place that's safe and secure and that's just for them. And so the irony was I acted like I pastored this group, but then I started a new church at the same time. And so we went and found sofas and love seats from all over the city, and we would hide them in an alley down a street in East LA. And every Sunday we'd pull them back out, and we would take all the stacked chairs out of the church, and we would build an entire city inside of this space. We had walls we put up. We brought the sofas and love seats. I would stack TVs up and created the most unexpected experience. And I had a band, and so that band and I wrote all the music, and we played every week on Sunday nights, and we created a uniquely different space. We started using dance and film, and the internet was just created around 1999. And so while I was speaking, I had this young guy going on the internet, downloading images while I was speaking. It was an explosion of human creativity. And so two things happened. The church on Brady maintained on Sunday morning, and then Mosaic emerged out of it.
So it was the evening service.
And then I took, that grew to maybe, the Church of Brady stayed at about 300 people, and that grew to about 500 people. And then, which isn't large, but it was for us. And then I took 50 of those people across the city to a nightclub that Prince owned. And I took the 50 edgiest, most outlier people, the people who didn't belong in that sense in the Christian culture, the ones that all the people in the morning were nervous about. And I knew that if I was going to actually reach LA, I had to take the people who were cultural outliers. And that's the people we took to start really Mosaic. And that's where we actually we created the name and created the culture. And then, interestingly enough, another church was started called Gateway. And that's really the church that was the church on Brady.
See, this is fascinating.
Yeah.
I did not know that. I didn't know that whole piece.
It's so nuanced, and we don't really talk about it because most people don't know about it. But it really is one of those things you have to realize. You actually don't transition churches. You have to transition people. And people don't always choose to change. And what we don't want to say out loud is, you don't transition a church of people, let's say with average age of the 50s, suddenly into a church of 20s. You're replacing them. And the average age of the church on Brady was probably, 55. And then the average age of Mosaic became 24. And it became dramatically different. And all that also had to do with communication, because they were used to things being communicated in a certain way. And the way I communicate the scriptures, the way I talk about God, the way I talk about Jesus, the way I talk about God didn't match the way they were accustomed to listening.
Yeah.
But the frequency from which I spoke, it really resonated with people who were artists and creatives and inventors and entrepreneurs and innovators. And for them, it was the first time in their life they'd ever had a conversation about faith that made sense to them. And, if you go forward 20 years, we had an Easter gathering, and I think there might have been 11 to 13,000 people. And we did a survey and asked, how many of you here are atheists? But you would say, I'm an atheist, but if God were out there, I'd be open. We had over 1,000 adults say, I'm an atheist, but if God were out there, I'd be open. That doesn't include all the atheists who were not open, who were there. It doesn't include all the agnostics that were there. It doesn't include all the Buddhists or Muslims or Hindus that were there. It only includes the 1,000 adult atheists who said, I'm an atheist, but I'm open. And I would just challenge you to find any community of faith in the world that has that kind of a relationship with unbelievers. And because what people would tell me, and I understand the dilemma, when people would come from other churches, when they moved from other parts of the world, from Australia, or they'd come from England, or move from Missouri, or they'd come to Mosaic and go, I don't know what I'm feeling, but it doesn't feel quite right. And I realized Mosaic isn't a place where a person who's a Christian who comes from a Christian church can come in and go, oh yeah, this is home. Because you're outnumbered. There's a psychological reality that happens when you're around people who believe like you. And so when you're in a room with 500 people who all believe in Jesus, you feel affirmed, you feel comfortable, you feel safe, you feel right. And then all of a sudden when you enter the room and you're with an equal number of people who don't believe, it has this odd kind of dynamic to it.
So there's a lot of people who are still listening, who are probably still trying to do a version of what you're doing 25 years ago.
Yeah.
Where, and so I want to drill down on that. So the morning, Mosaic became your all right, I get to do what I want here. I get to design the room. I get to communicate the way I want to communicate, et cetera, et cetera. But when you think about what you were doing on Sunday morning, did you make attempts to conform your communication style to the expectations of that crowd? Or were you trying to do what you were doing on Sunday night on Sunday morning, and it's like one of these things is just not like the other? Like, can you, because I think a lot of people feel that tension. They're like, well, this is how I want to communicate, but this is what the church can handle, or this is what my organization can handle. How did you handle that tension?
Yeah. I think the difference is it's not how I want to communicate. It's the only way I could communicate. And so on Sunday morning, I would try to communicate in a way that made sense to them. And I wasn't capable of doing it. Yeah. So I don't want to act like, wow, I'm good at all of this. I'm not. I was terrible at communicating to people who were linear and concrete. And I remember at one point, my wife and I went down to Saddleback and we heard Rick and she said, why can't you preach like this?
That's beautiful to hear.
And so I came back and I said, okay, I'll do the fill in the blanks. And finally, after a few months, my leadership team came and said, could you stop? You're just terrible at this. Nobody knows what the blank is. No one knows if you gave them the answer. You have 35 blanks. Rick has 5. and I realized that my approach to communication is so much connected to styles like digression. And it's a more organic and intuitive approach. And I was trying to fit into a more linear, concrete space. I think this is a part of the shift, is that when we talk about communication, you have to realize that the majority of American Christianity has filled its churches with people who are linear and concrete. And so they affirm and they need communicators who are linear and concrete. But the people who actually shape the future, the people who change culture, the people who create everything that even linear and concrete people want for the future are people who are more abstract, more intuitive, more organic, more universal in their thinking. And so one of the dilemmas is when you then think, okay, how do we reach these people for Jesus? Most of the time, if a person isn't linear and concrete, we think they're a heretic. And it's not because of beliefs. Because I can tell you, so many times people would say to me, well, in fact, I got a DM a couple days ago. Well, my friends tell me that you're a universalist, and and they go. And I said, well, it's so fascinating because, I could go down the list. I actually believe Adam and Eve are real people. Like, I don't know how more literal you can be, And I think the Genesis chapters 1 through 11 are the most fundamental chapters in the whole Bible. I believe that Moses, the God part of the waters through Moses. I believe that God sent fire down when Elijah prayed. I'm going, I don't know how you could be more uninteresting in terms of beliefs.
But you're a universalist.
I believe that Mary gave birth to Jesus. It was a virgin birth. And so when people tell me, well, yeah, but you're not, Orthodox. I go, well, okay, pick a space where I'm not Orthodox. The difference is this. I actually ruthlessly believe in the scriptures. And I do not allow my preconceived notions of truth to be protected when I go to the Bible. I think I'm actually more ruthless with the Bible. And I challenge everything I believe because of it. I think the difference is that I don't see reality the way Christians see reality. It's not that I don't see the scriptures in the way that I should see them. It's that I don't even see humanity in the way we should see them, or reality. It's the difference between being Newton and being Einstein. The moment Einstein sees that energy and matter are the same, everybody thinks he's out of his mind. And I think the reality is that most of Christianity still thinks that matter and energy are two different things. And because, that's the world from which Calvin came. It's the world from which Luther came. It's the world where our beliefs came from. And, even science tells us the world is much more dynamic than we could ever think.
Well, there's a certain sense, and I agree with what you said about everybody who fits into church pretty much fits the logical, linear framework. And I'd be one of those people. That's how, I was trained in law. That's how my brain works. That's how you're taught. However, you could argue that is all a hangover from the Enlightenment era, right? Where everything was rationalized, everything was intellectualized, God was explained away, or his existence was explained. Like, that is a lot of Enlightenment thinking. And you do really see that breaking down in postmodernism.
Yeah, and I think to be fair, rational thinking was so important to replace superstitious thinking.
Oh, okay, good point.
And so it's what you're battling against. And so I think if I had been born during that era, I would have been a completely irrational thinker going, no, superstition is something we need to put in the past. And the problem is that rationalism isn't the answer to every dilemma that we face.
Right.
And now it has become the problem, not the solution. Because you can't rationalize God. You cannot put God into a system. And any framework that understands God completely is completely wrong. and I think that somewhere along the way, we have to reclaim our love for mystery and uncertainty and wonder and artistry and beauty and the full essence of who God is. And I know eventually we're going to talk about communication, but I actually really love talking about God.
Yeah. Well, I love this conversation because it anchors it in a reality I think a lot of people can talk to. So let's go back to those first 5 years. Mm-hmm. And you've got a communication style. Talk about what that was, and then perhaps how that has changed or shifted over the years, or whether that shifted at all.
Yeah, I was thinking about this earlier today about, what is the journey in communication? And one of the interesting things to me, and I'm really grateful for this, is I grew up religious. I'm not grateful for that part, but I am grateful for that. My first encounter with Christianity was so positive, I couldn't have hoped for anything better.
Wow.
And it was in a church in Orlando, Florida. And the pastor teacher was a guy named Jim Henry. And I'd never heard a speaker in my life. So it was the first time I'd ever heard even a public speaker, much less a pastor. I didn't know that was a genre.
Because you weren't born in the U.S.
Yeah, I'm from El Salvador, and then lived in New York, Miami, and just in a religious family. So I didn't know that there were people out there giving speeches, and much less sermons, right?
Right.
And I was thinking about him, how I'm really grateful because the power of his communication was that he was authentic. He had this Mark Twain kind of wit and wisdom. He had incredible timing with bad jokes. and then he seemed to know how to seep into my soul and make me uncomfortable with my inner struggles that nobody knew about. And so I'm really grateful because my first experience with someone giving a message was incredibly transformational. It invaded me, and it let me know this could happen in communication. And I know a lot of people always say negative things about mega churches, and it was a mega church. But one of the positives was that he brought other speakers, and they were always really gifted.
Huh.
So I heard a lot of different styles of communicators. And this is back with cassette tapes.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
I remember those days. They were fun.
I'm at Chapel Hill at the University of North Carolina, and I'm just ordering cassette tapes and downloading them into my machine and listening to speakers all the time. And I'm listening for content. I'm trying to learn about the Bible. I'm trying to learn about God. I'm trying to learn about Jesus. But what I didn't realize is I was downloading different aspects of communication, different frequencies of communication, different skills, and they were all different. Some of them were more intense. Some of them were more poetic. Some of them were more intellectual and academic, and some of them were just motivational, and some of them were people who challenged you at a high level, and then some that just cast incredible vision. And I look back and I realize I was the beneficiary of these incredible communicators. And so when I think about the change in communication of the years, I think there's something universal about communication, that if you know how to connect to the human spirit, I have a feeling if we had been sitting there 3,000 years ago, it would have connected to us, or 1,000 years ago. And I mean, when you read Marcus Aurelius, when you realize, oh, this guy could be sitting in a forum at Harvard, and it would just absolutely shake our whole view of reality. And so I think there's an aspect of communication that's universal, and that's when it's most human and it's most authentic. And I think that authenticity and its humanity are what make communication transcendent.
Do you think that's ever a threat to people who live out of the linear, didactic, intellectual framework? Because I think you're right. Mm-hmm. Communication is connection. Communication is in, spirit to spirit, soul to soul. Do you think some people get threatened by that style?
Absolutely. Yeah. No, there's no question in the world. And I think there's several reasons for that. I mean, think about the etymology. The word communication comes from the same word as community.
True.
And so you cannot have healthy community without healthy communication. And the word communication and community come from the same etymology as the word communion. And you cannot commune without community and communication. And so it should actually become to us so enlightening when John says in the beginning was the Word. It's like God is the communication that brings communion. And there's this integration of who God is with what he says. There's almost no separation in that. And I think when people are incredibly linear and are transferring facts and data information, it's considered deep. Like if you're giving deep information, it's actually surface level. The deep conversations are the ones that mess with your soul.
Right.
They're the ones that mess with your inner world and change the way you see reality. And I find that to be the most exciting thing. Those moments when you know something transcendent has happened, that you've connected to people and they've connected to you in a way that is unexplainable. There was a season in my life where I was traveling, speaking to arenas of 20, 30, 40,000 people constantly. And the overwhelming feedback would be someone meeting me in the parking lot going, it was as if you were only talking to me. And I began to realize really quickly that when you speak to 40,000 people, it remains on the surface unless you're only speaking to one. And so in my mind, I've only always spoken to an audience of one person. There may be 50 people in a room or 5,000 or 50,000. But if I try to translate that as I'm going to speak to 50,000 people, I'm going to miss everyone. But if I make a human connection with one person, suddenly 50,000 people think they're that one person. I think that's the wonder of it.
No, that's fantastic. I do want to talk as well, because I want to dive into communication theory, et cetera. But, here you are, one of the cultural hubs of the world, LA. You've been here for better part of a quarter century. How has communication style in the culture shifted since the late 90s? Like, what were people more open to then? Because I think, it was you who told me, and I quote you endlessly on this, but to understand, what is it? Oh, I'm going to get the quote wrong. But to understand the future of the church, you just need to understand the present accurately. I think that's so true, right? But, there's a lot of people in churches using communication styles that are 30, 40, 50 years perhaps past. But in 25 years in LA, how have you seen communication shift in terms of how people hear?
Yeah, my daughter just turned 31, and that's how we mark our years. We came here when Mariah was 30 days old.
So it's 31 years.
We've been here 31 years.
Wow.
And I would say there's a lot of things that have shifted in terms of communication styles, not in terms of how people speak, but how people listen, and which is really more important. And because to become a great communicator, you have to become a great listener. And I think a lot of people just want to become a great communicator without becoming a great listener, and they don't realize that they hit their ceiling so quickly. This culture speaks in much shorter frameworks. And you might say they have a shorter of attention span, and I'm like, well, maybe they can know faster.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. And because, I was just in my office and I'm working on this graphic novel, and Elisa's, I'm looking at the storyboard and she's moving slowly. I said, Lisa, you got to go faster. I need to go faster. And I'll be looking at things with my wife, and she'll go, can you really see that fast?
Yeah.
And I can, I can process information almost at an unbelievably fast pace. And a lot of it is because I let the culture keep teaching me how to learn. And this culture learns really, really fast. It picks up things really fast. And so, yes, it loses its attention span because it doesn't take it 2 hours to learn what it used to take 2 hours to learn. It can learn it in 2 minutes sometimes. And it just distills information to a very functional practicality of what I need, what do I need, what do I need, what do I want to know. And I give you a good example. I have a person who used to be on our team. He has a PhD, and he would love reading books. And I said, okay, since you spend so much time reading books, What I'd like for you to do is when you finish a book, distill it to one page and tell everyone on the team what's the critical insight from the book. And he looked at it and he goes, I'm not capable of doing that. And I said, what do you mean? And he goes, I love reading books, but I don't know what the takeaway is. And I realized, there's a lot of people who are academic and they have all this information. But if you needed to have them distill it to the one thing you need to do today to succeed, they don't know what it is. And frankly, it's also true with entrepreneurs. And I work with an endless number of high performance entrepreneurs who started companies from scratch. And what's fascinating is that they didn't have any more information than anyone else. They had the same amount of information. They just had an instinct to know of all the information, what's the one piece of information I need to act on right now. And so you have a generation that's been trained to process information incredibly fast. And that's why TikTok, TikTok is entertainment here, but it's not entertainment in China. In China, it's education. So the same format that we're using for entertainment, China is using for education.
Wow.
And in fact, they do not allow Chinese children to access our TikTok, even though they're creators of TikTok, because they know they're shaping the mental structures of children. They're going to have the most intellectually sharp and refined thinkers in the world.
Well, it's sort of like Gladwell's Outliers, right? The whole education system there. That's really interesting about fast learning. And I hadn't actually thought about it and wouldn't mind spending a minute or two more on that, because a lot of dots started to connect for me when you said that, because our kids are around the same age. I got a 31-year-old, 27-year-old. They asked us a lot of questions until YouTube came along. And then all of a sudden they didn't need their dad anymore the way that I needed my dad to explain the world. And of course, that's just grown on steroids since then. But if you think about that, like somebody walking into a church in the 90s might not know a lot about Christianity. Maybe read the Bible, maybe read a book or two, maybe went to church once or twice. People have Googled whatever they're interested in to death when they show up at Mosaic today. They've been bombarded with all this, just more information than was imaginable 50 years ago. They've had it. And they're sort of content soaked. Has that changed your approach at all?
I don't know if it's changed my approach, but it actually has made my approach more effective.
How so?
It's funny. 20 years ago, I wrote a book called Soul Cravings, and it won an award. But what's funny about it is that when it won an award for Best Evangelism Book, along with Bill Hybels, like The Walk Across the Room or something like that.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, but the problem was that this is what they said. If you want to know how to do evangelism today, read Bill Hybels' book. If you want to know how to do evangelism 20 years from now, read Erwin McManus' book. So no one bought my book.
No one bought your book.
I said, thank you. You just gave me an award and a tombstone all at the same time.
And again, what was the book called?
It's called Soul Cravings.
Soul Cravings.
But no, the point of that is that if you are actually pressing into the future, it's as if culture catches up with you. And the reason we're here in LA and the reason we're still standing is because we're not communicating from the past. We're communicating from the future. But it's not like you have to be a neurosurgeon or understand physics. What you do need to understand is humans. What they know is that cliches don't work. What they know is that jargon is jargon. And what you'll find is that the churches where pastors use a lot of jargon and a lot of cliches and a lot of Christian language, they get packed with Christians.
Yeah. Even more so today, post-COVID.
Yeah.
Like there's this consolidation happening if you're a little bit political, mostly on the right, but somewhat on the left too, depending on where you are.
Right.
If you say the right things, if you use the right terms, you can pack an auditorium like overnight, but you're not really reaching people. You're consolidating the reach.
The difference is that when I speak on Sunday, I'm always in an internal conversation with the person who is least likely to believe anything I say.
I love that.
And so my conversations are always from the outsider in, not from the insider out. And I earn the right to give them my perspective. And it begins by communicating in a way where they know I know them. And, I think I posted the other day that some people speak at people, and some people speak to people, and some people speak for people, and then some people speak through people. And the kind of preaching that needs to happen now to engage a new world is you have to speak through people. You have to have a conversation where they don't know how you know this about them.
Okay. So what would an example be? Like if you were you can pull one from a recent message, one coming up, what does that involve, speaking through people?
Well, I would even do it like one-on-one. I was at this business event, and this former NFL player who became a multimillionaire in the business world, he's an atheist, and they brought him to me and said, hey, he's an atheist, you guys should talk. And as we began talking, I just took a minute, and he was very hardcore. He grew up in another religion and was very adamant that religion was evil and manipulative. And I just took a moment and said, hey, I'm just going to tell you what I see inside of you. And I just took a minute and just started telling him everything I saw. And then when I was finished, he said, how could you possibly know all that? And then I said, you don't believe in God, so you're going to have to figure this out. How could I know these things about you having not known you? I've spent my life studying human intrinsics and understanding human motivation, human behavior, and also listening to how people communicate. Carey, you've had conversations with your wife where, maybe she says one thing and means another thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a few of them maybe.
One time I wanted to go play basketball and I'd been gone for a while, and I asked him if I could go, and she said, sure, go right ahead.
Yeah.
I knew she didn't mean that. I knew what she's saying is, if you leave, it's going to be very, very bad for you today. And we all, when we know people, we can hear the frequencies of communication underneath what they've actually said. I can put this in a most unexplainable category. I was speaking at an event with about 5,000 people in Germany, and I had a German translator. And in the middle of my talk, I stopped and I looked at him and I said, you did not say what I just said. And he goes, what? And this is in front of 5,000 people.
He's translating this. I did not say what he just said.
He said, what? And I said, you did not say what I said. You said the opposite of what I said, didn't you?
Wow.
He goes, how could you know? I only speak German. You don't speak German. And I said, just answer the question. You didn't believe what I said, so you changed it to say what you thought I should say. He goes, yes, I did, but how could you possibly know? I knew because his frequency did not match my frequency. And I've done this across the world. I mean, in maybe 70 different countries, and I've tested this across the world, knowing that we know things not just from language, but from the frequency of that language. And you can think about it. It's like, if you take it down to a more basic level, like your dog. Do you have a dog?
I don't.
Okay,
no.
We have a dog. And you could say mean things to your dog in kind ways, and they think you're being kind to them.
Yeah.
Because they don't speak the language, they only hear the frequency. And what we don't realize is that humans are smarter than dogs. They understand the language and they hear the frequency.
So how do you listen for that? Like, you're addressing the people in a room like this on a Sunday morning. There's hundreds of stories per service. How do you determine what to say?
He goes, I know that I will speak to the most honest place in them if I get to the most honest place in me. And so it's not even about me having to figure out where everyone in the room is going, what they're going through. It's me looking at this issue of whatever it's loneliness, and extricating in the most honest and courageous way I can what that feels like for me and what I've gone through and how I've found my way through that without any cliches. And I just hate when people go, God wants it to happen, it's going to happen. And like all these statements we make about God, and, it was meant to be. And people without God have their own cliches too, and I just make sure there isn't a single cliche, that I can find an honest way to deal with something. So I just spoke, I think, last week on John chapter 5 on Jesus asking this guy who's a paralytic, trying to get to the water for 38 years, because he was told that when the water stirs, an angel stirs it, and if he gets there, he'll be healed. And I just started looking at that, going, what does humanity look like today in that? I go, it's this dog-eat-dog world. Can you imagine paralytics trying to push other paralytics aside to be the first one in the water? It's this view of God, that God is limited in his grace, limited in his generosity, limited in his goodness. So only the person who gets there first gets touched by God. So I just started asking myself, are you living your life in such a way where you actually believe that for you to win, everyone else has to lose? And even when you pray, do you pray prayers where you want God to be on your side against everyone else? Like when we pray, God, I want the Eagles to win. Yeah. What you're saying is, God, could you please make sure the Chiefs lose? And I don't care how many people need the Chiefs to win and how many people are praying or how many people's lives have been broken. This is the moment their dreams are going to come true. I don't care, God, how this might change the city of Kansas City. I just care that you care what I need. And so I just backtrack things and go, what is both the darkest and the lightest space that this moment reveals about me? And then when Jesus says, do you want to be well? And his answer is, I have no one to take me to the water. And I go, he doesn't answer the question Jesus asked, because he thinks he knows how to get well. And that's our problem, is that we keep thinking that we need to tell God how we're going to get well. And our prayers are all about telling God, this is what I need, rather than hearing the question, do you want to get well? And the answer should have been yes.
Yeah.
And so I just look at every passage in the Bible and I try to bring it down to its most human essence. And people with Jesus, people without Jesus, people who believe in God, people who are atheists, they all resonate with it because it's a human story in that moment. And that makes God more real.
So, Erwin, you've got this masterclass on communication that you've been offering for a little while. Can you tell me what's behind it? And a little bit, we'd love to break it down if you're open to it.
Sure.
And it's totally different. It's not like a $300 course you can buy online.
No,
or whatever.
it's
totally
a $5,000 course.
$5,000 course.
Yeah, it's
Wow.
very expensive. This was rooted in so much history. I've been married 39 years to my wife, Kim. She has a master's in theology. Thanks. And probably most of her marriage, she's asked me to write a book or to teach the world how to communicate. And, there are things everyone does well. Mm-hmm. And if you spend your life refining it, hopefully you can become good. And I think that if I've spent my life learning how to master something, I've spent my life learning how to master communication. And I've seen communication as an art form. And I don't see it just as a utilitarian tool to communicate a truth. I see preaching as an art form and communication as an art form. And when I give a talk, I see it as a moment where I'm painting in the same way Picasso would paint, or composing the same way Mozart would compose, or playing a game of chess the way Fischer would play. I see communication at the same level of beauty and opportunity for genius and transformation. And so I want to just give a backdrop of how I see communication. And for 40 years, Kim's like, teach communication. Then my son now is 34 and he's been, Dad, you just need to teach communication. And I just had people all over the world. And really the breakthrough moment for me is when, before the pandemic, when the world shut down and everyone went online, and I realized it all sounds the same. It's like white noise. And I began realizing that Christian speakers were eventually going to eliminate themselves because they all sound the same. So you only need one of them if 1,000 of them sound the same.
Right.
And they're not speaking from their most authentic voice. They were using a technique and a methodology that had been trained and told this is what preaching is like. And I remember sitting down with one of the most popular young speakers in America, and because he would always ask me about learning how to preach. And I said, you are so gifted that you will never have to become authentic. And because you're so popular and you're going to keep getting invited to more and more conferences as long as you don't become authentic. And I said, but I want to challenge you, because he said, what's my ceiling? I said, your ceiling is is your authenticity, that you're not transparent as a person. And he texted me like a week or two later, goes, hey, I tried to be transparent at this event. It didn't go well. He goes, it's harder than I thought. And then I think he just sort of bounced back because it's just easier to perform.
Through the formula. Mm-hmm.
And I feel that what's happened with young Christian speakers is because of the internet, because of Instagram, because of social media, because of popularity. You become famous at 24.
Yep.
You know, you write your book at 29, you know, and you have a following at 32, and you don't have time to actually grow into your authentic voice. You have to become the voice that they demand. It's as if everyone had to be early Beatles. And because, you know, the early Beatles were phenomenal, but then like pop comes almost out of that early Beatles, but Beatles kept evolving. They kept growing. I mean, they put out the White Album. They thought about how to design, you know, Sgt. Pepper's. It's like,
in 5 or 6 years, they're unrecognizable.
Yeah. And it's because they kept evolving, but Christian preaching is pop. It's afraid to be jazz. I mean, it's afraid to be any genre. It can't be Radiohead or Coldplay or U2 because it's afraid to lose its audience.
Yeah.
And so I created this communication course. One, at first I did it because I think God has given me an unusual voice, and I don't want to die and not transfer that to other people. And what I've spent 40 years learning about human communication, so I feel like if I leave anything behind, I want to leave this behind. And so it was a huge part of my own motivation was my team constantly asking me, could you teach us and teach the world how you think and how you process and how you've learned how to communicate? So it's a life work for me in that. And then what ended up happening was I ended up being asked to speak only in business environments, you know, through the pandemic and then out of the pandemic. I mean, I just don't get invited into the Christian space, which is, you know, perfectly fine because I feel like I'm doing what I'm supposed to do.
Right.
But I've been invited so much into the business space. And then some of the most successful and well-known business speakers in the world have come to me and said, we've been following you for years. We read your books. We listen to your talks. And do you know that you're the best in our space? But you just never have chosen to be in our space. And I realized, oh, these really world-class communicators really respect this. So I thought, I want to do this, one, because I want people to know it's a person who follows Jesus who's learned how to communicate at this level. And I would have never learned how to communicate at this level if I had not followed Jesus. Like, I just don't think that skill, that competency would have emerged out of me.
Why?
Carey, I was so shy and introverted.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, right. I was so reclusive and I also didn't have anything to say. I had a lot of things to ask and I had a lot of thoughts, but I don't know if I had anything to say. It was when I met Jesus, my life verse became, I think it's Jeremiah chapter 20, verse, I think it's 8 or 9, where it says, but if I say I will not mention him or speak any longer in his name, his word is in my heart like a burning fire shut up in my bones. I am weary of keeping it in. Indeed, I cannot. And that became like my life verse, that I want a fire that burns in me so brightly I can't keep it in. And what I found was that passion began to ignite all the other skills and competencies that I needed for communication. If I could say this, I think Jesus made me smarter. Like, I don't know if I was going to press the edges of my own personal capacity without having to deal with the deep issues of God and of life and of what it means to be human. And so when I realized, oh, this has value in the business space too, I felt like I'm going to create this. One, because it'll give me an entry into the business platform where I get to speak into people's lives that have no one who believes in Jesus speaking at their level. And they only respect performance. If you're great, if you're excellent, if you're the best, then they invite you. There's no kindness or, diplomacy. It's just a clear bottom line.
Yeah, it's a value proposition.
And I love that value proposition. I love being measured against the best in the world. And if I fail, I fail. If I succeed, I succeed. And on the other side of it, I think the message of Jesus deserves the best communicators in the world. And the great tragedy is when things that are false are communicated more effectively than that which is true. And we think people are rejecting it because they're rejecting the truth. And I think they're rejecting it because they're rejecting our lack of preparation, of insight, of authenticity, of humanity in our messaging.
That's really good to talk about. So I don't know if this is helpful or not, but you've got 7 frequencies of communication.
I do.
Yeah. Do you want to give us either an overview, a sampling, a breakdown, take it as deep or as cursory as you'd like?
What I came down to as I developed the art of communication, and it's broken down to different sections like the 3 human intrinsics, the 5 elements of the communicator, and then the 7 frequencies of communication. And the 7 frequencies of communication are what I would identify as 7 signature frequencies that are most common and in communication. And they're not at the same level of frequency. Some of them are more common, some of them are more rare. And so if I were just kind of walk through maybe the more common frequency to the more rare frequency, I think the most common frequency, at least on social media, is the motivator. And I love motivators and I like listening to them, but motivators love to inspire you. They love to encourage you. They're never going to say probably anything negative in their talk,
right?
You know, and they're never going to call you out or challenge you or confront you about anything you've done wrong, but they are going to fill you with so much value and sense that I can do this, whatever it is, and I think that most pastors fall into one of 2 categories. And I think motivators are one of them, where they, their hope is to inspire people, to help them believe that God is for them, and I think sometimes they're seen as, on the negative, like maybe superficial or not as deep. And it's because they're not trying to get into the mud. And maybe someone like a Joel Osteen would be like a motivator.
Let's give an example of someone who'd be a classic communicator.
I think Joel Osteen on the big scale, and I think Chad Veach. I love Chad Veach.
Yeah, Chad here in LA.
Right, Chad Veach is a motivator. He inspires you, he encourages you. You feel like he loves you, right? And he's for you, and he likes me. He doesn't know me, but he likes me. Yeah. And it's not just what he says. Before Chad Veach opens his mouth, there's a frequency that lets you know I'm for you. And he inspires, he encourages, and motivators I think are the most liked oftentimes.
Yep.
And it's the most frequent, I think, frequency on social media because people so desperately need motivation in life and need to be encouraged. And I remember one time my sister, Lee, she said, I like Joel Osteen and he's my happy pill. And what she meant by that was I get depressed a lot. I have a hard life. I go through a lot of brutal stuff. I turn on Joel Osteen. I just feel inspired.
Is that also your friend John Gordon? Would you put him in the?
I put John Gordon in. Yes, I do put him in a motivator category, and that's lets you see that motivators can be different.
Yeah,
right. Because Joel will be different than Chad. He'll be different than John. John is so much a guy who wants to motivate and inspire, which is interesting because he will tell you he was the most negative, pessimistic person in the world, but he reversed it by becoming positive.
Yep. At what, 29 or so? Yep. He converted to Christianity. And then I think shortly after that, his wife is like, you're so negative.
I led John to faith.
He talks about that.
Yeah,
it's really powerful.
And
we'll link to
we're
the
best
episodes.
Friends now.
Yeah. We'll link to the episodes we've had with John on this show too in the show notes if people want to go back.
Very cool.
He tells that story.
And I see him as a motivator. And he inspires, he encourages, he brings enthusiasm, he brings hope into the room. And right next to a motivator, but not the same as a challenger.
Okay.
And now a challenger is that person that they see everyone as someone who needs to be called out and called up. A challenger, for them, things are never good enough. It's great that you did that, but you should have done that.
Hey, let's talk.
The challenger's the football coach. You're winning, 28-0, and at halftime he's chewing you out because you missed this block and you dropped this pass and you missed this read, and they're just constantly moving toward improvement. And I also think there are a lot of challengers on Instagram and challengers in social media, challenges. Not as many challengers as much as pastors as much. Because I think because of the nature of culture, people in the church are afraid to challenge.
So who would be like some challengers? I'm thinking Alex Hormozy.
I don't know.
Do you know Alex?
No, I don't.
No, anyway, it could be my buddy Mark Clark. I don't know that you know Mark. He would be a challenger. He's at Bayside these days, but incredible communicator.
Very, very cool. There's this guy on Instagram called, I think, the Hip Hop Preacher.
Oh, yeah. I think I follow him.
And he is such a challenger. He's the guy that goes, you owe you. And it's almost like he's mad at you, but he's mad at you because he believes in you.
Right.
And both my kids and my wife all have a little challenger and a lot of challenger in them. And so they're always letting me know how I can improve, how I can do better, and how I can step up as a dad. It's always great to have that in my life. And, and then next to a challenger, and each one of them has a shadow side too, by the way.
Okay.
And so
is it worth going into?
Like the shadow side of a motivator is a performer. And that's why a lot of times young Christian preachers are so much performers. It's because their natural frequency is motivator, but they haven't developed that and found confidence in it, so they're performing. And that's where sometimes you can feel like, I feel a disconnect. I don't know if they're really inspiring me or needing to be inspired by this moment.
What about the challenger's shadow side?
The shadow side of the challenger is manipulator. Because when the challenger's frequency is healthy, they're getting you to do what you need to do, to find the courage to take on your task, your dream, your challenge. But when they're working from their shadow, they're using their challenger to get you to do what they want you to do. And you can feel this overwhelming, oppressive weight on you that I have to do this because this person is demanding it of me.
Yeah.
And then next to the challenger would be a commander.
Okay. And
the challengers and commanders are different. A challenger calls you out, but a commander tells you what to do. And what's interesting about the commander frequency to me is that it's a frequency that needs to be used more rarely, but some people use it all the time. And they don't even know how to ask a question without command. It always comes as a command.
Is that more older generation, large and in charge, command style? No, you still see it.
I'll tell you. My wife, his number one frequency is command.
Okay.
My son, Aaron's, his number frequency is command. My daughter, Mariah, her number one frequency is command. But they also have complementary frequency. Like Aaron has two number one frequencies, command and seer, which we'll come to later. And Mariah has two high frequencies of command and maven. And so they have different textures of it. But what's really funny is when they'll send you a text, like Aaron was sending a text to one of the guys on team going, he said something like, send me a photo. And he adds, please, I'm trying to not use my commander frequency. And the other guy said, I'm a commander too. I love the language.
I get it.
Don't add words.
Okay.
And I'll come home and we came to Mosaic on Sunday, and right before we got out of the car, I parked the car, and my wife goes, turn off the car. And I looked at her, I said, you've been gone for 2 weeks to Africa. I was turning off the car every day. and
I survived, believe it or not.
But it's funny. I'll joke about it. She'll say, "Take out the garbage," and I say, "I know it means I love you." And once people began to realize they have this commander frequency, my son will actually tell me, "Dad, I'm going to give you a bunch of ideas and a bunch of suggestions. They're all going to come out like commands, but I want you to know they're not commands. They're just ideas and suggestions." And it has transformed our communication.
Wow.
Okay? Because when you can help a commander, because if you're going into a burning building, you want a commander.
Yeah.
You don't want someone who needs consensus or team building.
Right.
You just want someone who knows what to do and does it. If you're at sea in a ship, you want a commander who knows how to get through a storm. Command is important when you need someone to be in charge. I think like Bill Belichick from the Patriots would be command. Do your job. That's the theme of the Patriots. Do your job. It's not very inspiring, except that when you're a commander, it's so clear.
Well, and it worked.
Yeah.
For many years.
Right. Mm-hmm. Do your job. It's very, very simple. And you see commanders out in the space, but sometimes what happens is you start feeling like, wait a minute, this person just keeps telling me. And after a while, it gets too hard. Yeah. And I try to tell commanders, look, if you're a commander at work, make sure you don't go home and remain a commander with your wife and your kids. If you have a little 5 or 6 year old daughter or 10-year-old son, and all you're using is command, you're going to just devastate their spirit. Mm-hmm. And so with commanders, I try to help them find a complementary frequency that they can use. And because everyone doesn't just have one frequency.
Yeah.
And then outside of commander, there's a healer. There's a healing frequency. I think a lot of pastors of small churches have a healing frequency.
Yeah.
And so for them, it isn't about how many people in the room. It's about how much healing and help and hope I can bring to people in the room.
Sort of shepherding, caregiver, that kind of vibe.
But not always. Do you know who Lewis Howes is?
Oh, yeah, I know Lewis.
Lewis and I have become really good friends. I love Lewis. And I saw him here at Mosaic just a few weeks ago. And I said, Lewis, you are completely a healer frequency. And he put his hand on my chest. He goes, thank you so much. Oh. And you could just feel like he just loved the fact that he was seen. And if you listen to his podcast, it's called The Summit of Greatness. Yeah. It really should be called The Summit of Healing.
You're right. He's always in how to get better, how to improve, how to
get over your wounds, how to get past your hurts, and how to deal with, childhood trauma. His whole frequency is one of healing, but it's called the Summit of Greatness, because for him, greatness is in bringing healing to the world, and that is so completely his frequency. And then there's a professor frequency which deals with data and facts. When you have a professor frequency, it's about the transmission of truth, transmission of information. And I also think a lot of pastors, or actually academics, who find the one job they can have is pastoring, but they would rather be at a university. And I remember when I was in England, I think they did a study that out of 25,000 Lutheran pastors, only 22 of them identified themselves as having had a born-again experience with Jesus.
Oh.
And what you find is that people go to become a pastor the same way someone goes to become a lawyer. Because if you're academic and if you love the transference of information, if you love learning and then transferring that learning, that's your frequency.
Okay, so that's a professor.
Yeah. Huh. And then there's 2 lesser common frequencies. One would be the seer, which what we oftentimes would call the visionary. And seers, one of the things you do know about a seer is that seers tend to erase lines of possibilities. They elevate your sense of who you can become, of the world that can be created, of the possibilities, and they're super integrated to the future. In fact, seers have a hard time remembering the past or being in the present, and they're still always talking about tomorrow, always talking about tomorrow. And I have a real strong seer frequency, and a lot of times my wife's like, could you just be present? And my mind just races into the future really quickly, and I can't help it. That's just a frequency at which I live and think and go. And then the 7th frequency is something called a maven. And this is the most rare frequency. And I had to be perfectly frank, it was the last frequency I was able to identify. And a lot of it was because as I was working through the frequencies, I was actually trying to combine some frequencies and trying to find ways to, narrow it down. But I got rid of frequencies when a frequency covered it.
Yeah.
And then I said, okay, no, these stand alone. And so I thought, well, isn't a maven like a seer? But it's not. I remember maybe 10 years ago, someone asked me, like, what motivates you? And I remember just blurting out, I live to violate your view of reality. And that was the most honest statement I've ever made about my communication.
And is that maven?
Yeah.
Really?
Mavens aren't really casting a vision for the future. They are deconstructing your view of reality. And I remember, oh my gosh, probably 15 years ago, I was in Australia and Planet Shakers asked me to speak in Melbourne. They picked me up in the car and I'm driving to the event and they said, hey, just so you can know, people are so excited you're here. And whenever you speak truth, everyone will just start cheering and clapping. And I said, well, what do you mean? And they go, whenever you speak truth, the crowd, the audience is just going to be with you. Everyone's going to just explode. It's really exciting. And I said, do you mean that every time I say something that they already believe, they're going to cheer and clap? They go, yes. I said, yeah, that isn't really my experience.
That is evangelical culture.
Yeah. I said, my experience is when I say my most important statements, the room goes quiet. And they're not sure if I'm right. And they're not sure if they should agree, but they think they agree. And I create that tension of disbelief and belief. And there are fewer people who do that, and it's a disruptive frequency. And it hasn't always been something I was aware of. And the reason I didn't identify it is because I couldn't see it because it was me.
Right.
I could see the other frequencies because I could see them in other people. So clearly, the hardest thing to see is who you are.
Mm-hmm. So you're a maven and a seer?
Yeah, I think in clusters. I think I'm a maven, seer, challenger.
Right.
These are the three that are probably most dominant. And then I have this fourth that is a healer. And what is, I think, odd for people is that when I'm speaking on a regular basis here, they heal, they experience a healing frequency when I'm speaking. At the same time, they're experiencing a maven frequency.
Right.
And so there are two frequencies happening at the same time, and that's what creates the dissonance. I can give you an example of a few, like when I listen to Ed Milet.
Yeah.
I think he has commander and healer.
Oh, that's interesting.
And so both frequencies are happening at the same time, and so it creates this incredible dynamic because he's commanding you, so you know he has authority. You just believe that he can tell you what to do. And you want him to tell you what to do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, there's this healing frequency where he feels like he cares about you and he wants you to get better and he knows your pain, and they're happening at the same time.
Yeah.
And I've listened to several people along the way. And in fact, I've watched, you ever watch on TikTok or Instagram where somebody gets a clip from someone else and their own clip and a clip from someone else and their own clip? What's really fascinating is you watch someone trying to imitate someone who actually has a frequency. And you can see the dissonance in the frequency. And it's not that they're being dishonest, they're just using a different frequency. I watched someone do this with Oprah, and Oprah was speaking from such a powerful healer frequency. It was so authentic and so a part of her essence. And then the person slipped to their clip saying something similar. It's completely a motivator. No healer at all.
Wow.
And
you're right.
Yeah. And I'm telling you, one of the things that excites me at this is that once we designed the 7 frequencies, we couldn't unsee them.
Yeah.
And once I started teaching it to our team, it became like the common language and people being seen and understood and knowing how to communicate with each other so much better. One of the things is I was working with someone, they thought they were a motivator, and it was their number 7.
That's going to be painful, trying to work your way into that.
Yeah. And this guy is, he probably makes 10 to 20 million a year.
Wow.
So he's super successful. But he thought he was a motivator, but he actually is not. And that's why he ends up with this back end problem of people who feel really discouraged. Because what he thought is a motivator frequency was actually a challenger frequency. And I realized, I've done that a million times where I thought I was motivating people and I was actually challenging them or I was casting vision, but I wasn't motivating them. And my team would come to me and go, hey, we really would love for you to tell us like what we're doing great. And I realized, I hold great at a really high standard. And so it's hard for me to say you're doing this great.
Right.
But a motivator, they see everything as great.
Everything's wonderful. Thank you.
You didn't spill the coffee.
Way to go. Way to go.
You're crushing it. And I had to actually learn the pattern of identifying what people are doing well. And I would say, great job, great job. I thought that was a motivator frequency. That is not a motivator frequency. Great job, great job. And my team came back and said, we don't believe you. Because when we ask you, which job did we do that was great? I'd go, all of it.
Yeah, it's great. Great job. Thank you.
And they go, we'll believe you when you identify something specific that we're doing great. And it has, for me, created so many different dynamics, realizing when something isn't your frequency, you probably think you're using it. when you're not. And here I think is the more powerful thing. If you can pay attention to other people's frequencies and realize people hear from different frequencies, and they don't always hear from the frequency from which they speak. I think one of the millennial challenges is that a lot of millennials speak from commander, but they hear from healer.
Okay. Say more about that. So they speak commander. How does that show up in millennials?
They feel it's their right to tell you what's wrong with you.
Yeah. I'm going to make a pronouncement now about the world, about you, about the future, and...
Yeah. Let's just pick an issue. Let's say like climate change.
Yep.
Right. It's a good one,
Mm-hmm.
And so if a millennial will start talking to you about climate change, they won't talk to you. They might yell at you about it.
Right. And they'll say, is that t-shirt sustainable?
Mm-hmm.
How much meat are you eating?
And then I'll say, was that t-shirt made by children in slavery? And because you paid so little for it.
Uh-huh.
And then they'll go, what? You can't speak command back to command. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah, because they're very sensitive.
That's right, because they speak from a commander frequency, but they hear from a healer frequency. And the temptation is, I'm gonna return hammer for hammer. I'm gonna return challenger for challenger. I'm returning commander for commander, but you're going, no, what I have to do is I have to receive this commander and return with, let's say, seer, give him a bigger picture of the world and reality.
So what do you do if you're commander and you're generally speaking to a lot of people who need healing? Like you think about the church, disproportionate number of people, like overrepresented, the number of people who are in crisis, transition, challenging season of life. That's when you go back to church. It's just usually been true. A lot of wounding there, sometimes by the church, sometimes by life. You tend to be a challenger, you tend to be a commander, but the people you're speaking to, their receptive mode is they need some healing. What do you do with that?
I think this is a really important question.
Yeah.
And I don't want to go into specifics, but some of the biggest church systems in the world have collapsed over the last couple of years.
Yeah.
And a huge part of it is because they were commander frequencies, singularly commander frequencies. And you would think that people who need a healer frequency wouldn't go to churches that have a commander frequency, but they do, because they're so broken that they're willing to be told what to do. But they're not getting healed. And then and the problem with the commander frequency is that you cannot allow there to be a violation of trust. Because to have a commander frequency, you have to have authority and respect and trust.
Yeah.
And the moment you lose respect and trust, that commander frequency then is seen as dictatorial. Because the shadow side of a commander is a dictator. And so you have people who flood to commander cultures who actually need healing.
Wow. We could do an hour on that.
Because they get told what to do. And when you're broken, you don't want the responsibility of making your own decisions. So you abdicate that and let someone else make decisions for you. And that way, if it goes bad, you can blame someone else.
Oh, man.
So there's a lot there.
You just really rocked my world. Like, you know, one of those insights where so much just flashes before your eyes at once. That's really interesting. So
it's also why sometimes when there are pastors in large systems who have like a moral failure or have a financial failure or have, just some kind of failure, and maybe it's not as pronounced as you would think, but there's no grace for them. It's because commander frequency, it creates respect, but it doesn't create love. And so the moment that respect's gone, there is no love to catch you. And one of the things you have to really consider when you're leading people is, are you leading with love and respect?
How do you do that?
I actually think that's the most intentional aspect of leadership. I sign so many of my notes, love and respect, when I write to people. And it's really, for me, based around, I will not use my power for my good. but for the good of the whole, for the good of others. I actually think that's the love part. The love is, I don't lead because I have a psychological need to lead. I lead because for whatever reason, God's given me some skills, gifts, or abilities to help people live a better life. And then the respect part is living a life that matches what you say. And there's an assessment I use with a lot of high-level people called the Berkman.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of it.
Yeah. Oh, we'll have to do it together someday.
Oh, that'd be fun.
Okay.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I can identify in it is a couple of interesting things. One is how much energy a person uses to create a persona rather than allow people to see their authentic selves. But another thing I can actually see is how much you need to win versus win-win, win-lose, and lose-win. Mm-hmm. How much you need to be at an advantage.
Gotcha.
And across the board, 99% of everyone I've ever graphed has a extremely what's called a high advantage. But their perception is that they're low advantage.
Oh.
So their perception is, I'm willing to lose. I'm willing to let you have the better end. But it's only the inner story we tell ourselves. We actually always intend to win.
Desperately want to win.
And one of the great, I think, insights I had in my own life is that when I first went through this like a decade ago, that's one of the places where I'm actually the reverse. Mm. And when the consultant called me when I first went through from Germany, he said, you actually have what's called a low advantage. My perception is the number is like a 16 out of 99. So I perceive that I wouldn't really take advantage of people, but my actual number is an 8. And so he said, this is like so rare that we need to walk you through this because you'll let people take advantage of you all your life.
And this goes back to what we talked about before. You're always paying the bill.
Yeah.
Do you remember that?
Oh, I do remember
Part
that.
of the conversation. Yeah. And I've thought about that. I've been letting occasionally people pick up the check from time to time.
That's good.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're a low advantage person, the downside is you don't even realize you might be unhealthy as a lose-win relationship person. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But the upside is you would never take advantage of anyone.
Yeah.
And what you have to realize is happening a lot of times is that we live in a cultural environment where we're raised to have an advantage. The reversal isn't the normative. So when I talk to someone who is let's say a 1695, and they go, wait a minute, am I really like this? And I go, here's the good news. That's what humans look like.
Yeah.
You know, you're not an aberration. This is the norm.
Right.
Something has to glitch somewhere along the way for you not to be like that. Yeah. But when you become aware of that, you realize, I'm always going to perceive as if I'm losing, even though if I'm winning. And when you go back to millennials in the conversation, and you look at the 7 frequencies, one of the challenges is that we actually don't even know our full intention when we're communicating. And so let's say you're high advantage, but you have a low advantage perception. You're communicating as if you're a low advantage, but what a person's sensing in your frequency is the high advantage, and they can't figure out why. Now imagine that on a platform. When you go to pastors and leaders who have massive collapses, you're communicating service, you're communicating sacrifice, you're communicating humility, you're communicating all these virtues, and you expect everyone to live them out. But somehow the subtext is, but not you.
I'm the exception to the rule?
I'm the exception to the rule because of how God chose me to be this person.
To be the leader.
Yeah. Wow. And once you see yourself as the exception to the rule of all the virtues of Jesus, you're in real trouble. Mm-hmm. But the problem is you often don't see it. And then everyone around you affirms your distorted view because of your talent. And it for me is a really critical issue. I know we keep leaving communication and talking about all these other issues, but I think communication is in many ways, it's the organism that touches everything we do in human life.
And it's how most people access you in these large organizations, large churches, large companies, how do people access you? They access you through Sunday morning, through your keynote addresses, through your talks, through your public communication. So if you're in that situation, high command people, high need for love, healing in the congregation, and let's say you don't have a double life. Let's say there's no hidden affair, there's nothing, because honestly, that's probably the vast majority of cases.
Yeah.
I know we don't hear about that.
The exception is the mess.
Yeah, the exception is the headline, the exception is the rule. But I imagine there are people here who would be like, okay, if I did your assessment, I'm high command, we have a younger church, high need for healing, to listen in the healing mode. Is that just a trap destined to catch people? Is a bomb ready to go off? Or how do you navigate that?
No, I think that Mosaic would have been probably so better served if I had been more of a commander.
Oh, really?
In fact, if you listen to both my kids, they would absolutely agree. And they said, there have been many times, Dad, where you should have just told us. And instead of trying to just inspire us or grow us or or challenge us, because there are times people just need the clarity of command.
Right.
And it is true. But I would say that it's so rare that I've used that particular frequency, that in 38 years of marriage and 34 years that Aaron's been alive and 31 years that Mariah's been alive, they've almost never seen me use command in their life. And one time Mariah came to me and said, I just need you to tell me what to do. Don't be Yoda. I don't need you to be a sage. I just need you to tell me what to do. Yeah. And then I said, then I started asking questions. And I'm just not designed like that. When I think I'm commanding, I'm actually inquiring.
Right.
But I do think that you can command effectively. You can command well, but you need as a team of people who have other frequencies. You need a team with someone has a healer frequency and someone has a motivator frequency. In fact, one of the things we've realized at Mosaic is we need more motivator frequencies who are being used on our platforms. And because, Aaron is like a visionary seer commander, and Mariah is like this very, very mavenish kind of challenger. And I feel them as motivators. But when you listen to a real motivator, you realize, there's a massive gap. My wife, she'll get on the platform and I'll say, honey, don't tell them what to do. And she'll get there, she goes, everyone raise your hand.
Oh, wow, there you go.
She can't help it. I can't have her do the offering because she'll go, you need to give right now. Like and she can get away with it because everybody loves her. And she goes to Africa and Ukraine and she's the most courageous human being. So everybody admires her. So she has a lot of texture for command. But we don't have a lot of motivators who just inspire people. And I think some of that is probably, according to the survey of my family, it hasn't been the highest value for me. I'm so self-motivated that I don't really need that frequency in my life very much.
So if you're a commander and you're leading a church, and I think, the listening mode being a need for healing, maybe the answer is self-awareness and a more diverse platform as far as communication frequencies go. Yeah, that's a good idea.
I think that when you're a commander, you need to understand the cluster of frequencies that are available to you. And then realize that commander is, it's a spice. It's not the meal. And if you overuse it, people will stop listening to you. I listened to someone recently, and I don't want to say who it is. I love this person, but their whole talk, they were just yelling at us for 40 minutes.
It's a lot of yelling.
And it was in the business world. It wasn't in the Christian world. I'd expect a preacher to yell at me for 40 minutes, but it was a business guy just yelling at us, telling us everything that we need to do right and everything we do wrong and how to, change and how to make the difference. And I it was like putting my head into a fire hydrant. I'm going, I need the water, but I can't drink this. And so I feel like there's a huge need for self-awareness there. But I also feel that my experience is people who have a commander frequency usually have a high level of intelligence. It's just that they haven't actualized their emotional intelligence at the level that they need to. And I think this is an important note. It's Carol Dweck who wrote Mindset. Phenomenal book, right? Incredible. And 7 frequencies is completely built on a growth mindset. It's not built on a fixed mindset. When you look at personality assessments or the Enneagram, you're a 9 or you're a 5 or you're a 4, and that's who you are. If you look at the Myers-Briggs, you're an ENFJ or an ISTP, and that's who you are. And this is a growth mindset. You have a core frequency, but the aspirational goal is to be able to actualize all 7 frequencies as an elite communicator. And so you may have a 7th frequency, but you should be able to pull that frequency up whenever you need it. And I think one of the psychological places to be is, I remember when Mariah was around 14 years old, she was a musician. We were driving home one day and she said, Daddy, I think I do the same thing you do. I said, well, what's that? She said, you said that if your message is ever going to connect to someone, it has to connect to you first. I said, yeah, I said that. And she goes, I know that if a song is going to connect to anyone, it has to connect to me first. And I looked at her and I said, how can you understand this at 14 when I can't get all the pastors to get this? See, frequencies are not about trying to get people to feel something. It's about getting in touch with your own inner world and feelings. And then when you actualize that, the room connects to it.
So because I wanted to ask this question now because we had talked about it earlier, but authenticity.
Yeah.
So people can discover their natural communication style. Maybe they see themselves already. But I think you're right. There's a lot of imitation. There's a lot of plagiarism. Now we have ChatGPT, which can write a message for you pretty crappily. But wait till 4, 5, 6. We're in 3 right now. Yeah. Which I think is a whole story for a whole other day. But I'm just wondering if you see people who think, I have to be a healer, or I have to be a professor, or I have to be a motivator, right? But they're not really that.
It's not going to go well.
Yeah, like what happens? Because I get a lot of leaders saying, what do I need to do to get a platform? I get that question a lot, as I'm sure you do. And I'm not sure there's anything you need to do to get a platform, but part of my advice is don't be somebody you're not.
Yeah.
Because the good news, and that's one thing I really admire about you, is, I followed you for many, many years, have known you for a number. You're pretty consistent. The message hasn't varied a whole lot, and you've taken some hits for it. But the good news is you get up every morning, you get to be Erwin, right? The way God designed you. I get up at this stage of my life, and for many years, I get to be me. It's like I'm not pretending to be somebody. These are conversations I'm genuinely interested in, love asking questions. The writing I get to do, the speaking I get to do, it kind of flows from the inside out. But I don't think that's everybody's experience.
Yeah.
And there were definitely times in my leadership where I felt like, I've got to be more like Rick Warren or Andy Stanley or Christine Kane or whatever. And then I'm like, I was on, do you know John Acuff?
I just met him recently.
I love John. Yeah. And I've done a lot of speaking with him. And I always felt the pressure 10 years ago to be like, you got to be more funny. And then I'm like, no, I'm not funny. I'm not funny like John. That's his thing. And my thing is I'll come up with the bullet points, right? Or whatever. What do you do when you're not, if somebody's listening to this realizing, I don't think I'm in my authentic voice? Can you play out what the pitfall is of that? Like what happens to you long-term if you stay out of your lane, out of your frequency? And then what to do to become more in touch with your frequency?
Yeah, there's a lot there, because when you get paid to communicate, it changes the dynamic for you.
Yeah.
And then you're being paid by this, let's say by a church, and you're being paid in the sense, in their mind, to communicate the way they want you to communicate and say what they want you to say.
Back to the 90s, right? Where you were, right?
And one of the things you have to begin to ask yourself is, are you like a boat just bringing goods from one side, one port to another? So it's not really about you. It's just, this is a truth, let's say, in the book of Romans, and I'm translating it to the people here, but I'm just the boat. I'm not affecting the goods.
Right.
Or am I supposed to have my own unique voice? Is it essential to me to be uniquely me, to have my own voice, that I have my own perspective? And ironically, people may fire you for that. And just realize that most churches don't hire you to be you. And they hire you to be who they want you to be.
So true.
And so it has less to do with communication. It has to do with sociological dynamics, and of culture. I've always just chosen to be unemployed and unique rather than employed and the same.
Yeah. I think it creates a cognitive dissonance that gets really hard to live in.
Yeah, it does.
If you're, wearing Saul's armor, if you're trying to fit into skin every week that isn't yours, or adopt a voice that isn't yours, I don't know. I would just think that would have to be exhausting.
I think personally, you don't want to live your life being someone you're not. And you don't want to live your life giving messages that don't change you.
Wow. Yeah.
And so for me, a minimal criteria for any message I give is that the message has to change me, has to impact me, has to shape me. And I think a part of becoming a more authentic voice is getting in touch with who you really are. And I'm pretty open about, my life, my world, my inner world. Sometimes I know it frustrates Kim going, I wish you wouldn't say that you're that, or I wish you wouldn't say this, but I've struggled. I've struggled, with OCD throughout all my life. I've struggled, I have neurological challenges I've had all my life, and I feel like it makes me more human. It helps me relate to people. And the really wonderful thing about being more human is that you have a better platform for then aspiring toward greatness. Because when you aspire toward greatness and no one then sees any of your flaws and you act like you're perfect, people will almost despise the greatness in you.
Yeah. They're almost excited to see you get knocked down a peg or two.
But if people can relate to you and they feel like, there's a part of you that's the common person and you connect to everyone and you're human and down to earth, more often than not, they're going to celebrate your success. They're going to celebrate the things about you that make you unique and great. And I remember years and years ago, my brother Alex, he said to me on a phone, because we're talking about something and I was probably frustrated, and he said, Erwin, God has not called you to be original. He's called you to be effective. And I didn't realize he was quoting Rick Warren. So he wasn't being original. He was actually just being effective.
Actually, that's clever.
And I was depressed the whole week, wondering if that was true. And I remember calling him back a week later and I said, hey, Alex, I've thought about what you said. Maybe God hasn't called you to be original, but God has definitely called me to be original. But I actually think God has called us all to be original. I don't think the measure is effectiveness. And I think it's being authentic and honest and true to who you are, and then allowing the effectiveness to come out of that. Like I'm smart enough to have known how to be famous in the Christian world. I just chose not to be. I could have made different choices. I could have started my church in a different part of the country, in a different suburb, in a different spot. Like I can never say, oh, I just didn't know. I knew. I just chose not to. I came here because I felt these people don't really have the gospel in a way that makes sense to them. I go after people who are outliers because I feel like they don't really have someone who they can connect to at a deep level. And you have to make choices and decide, I'll take that success. I'll take the success where I wake up in the morning going, yeah, I've lived my unique life. Maybe I left success on the table at a level that other people think I should have been successful. I could have written books that sold millions. I'm just bright enough to be able to do that, but I wrote books that mattered to me. And there's a difference, and you have to decide, who you do what you do for. And I think that's what I would say to pastors is, don't spend another day of your life being what other people want you to be,
And some of that, I don't know that you had this or not, but for me, I've spent a lot of time over the last 10 years sort of embracing who I really am. And there's a little bit of disappointment that I've always had to get over in my 40s and 50s. It's like, yeah, you're not as funny. No, you're not as smart. No, you're not as quippy. You're not as clever. But there's also a beauty and a peace in like going, oh, okay, this is who I am, right? Like this is how I communicate. But those frequencies, Erwin, to your credit, I mean, I'm speaking here in LA tomorrow, and it's funny, I already know what I'm going to say, but thinking through the frequencies, it's helped me rethink the talk already and maybe land in a slightly more aware tone and go for the connection rather than the, quote, performance. Because the pressure to perform never really goes away in this sphere, does it?
So let me give you a little exercise.
Yeah, sure.
We understand when a person is monotone.
Mm-hmm.
And we always say, change your cadence or change your intonation or change your rate of speech. And those are 3 ways, right, that you can try to not be monotone.
Yeah.
But you need to change your frequency.
Mm.
When I went to Lewis Howe's event, the Summit of Greatness, and spoke there, before I got on stage, I told myself, I want to really step into this healer frequency about 3/4 of the way through. But because it's not my primary frequency, I can get so much momentum that I forget.
Right.
So I told myself, I'm going to do something I've never done before. And so I began the entire talk with just being so present and stepping with a healer frequency. And then I shifted to my Maven frequency, and the whole message was transformed for me. And then I did a book signing afterwards, and people just kept coming and they started weeping, going, I don't know why, but I started feeling like I was being healed.
So how did you do that? What did you do to start in your healer frequency?
I spent a few minutes, it didn't take long, to remember a moment in my life where God healed me, where I was going through pain, where I was struggling, where I felt alone or overwhelmed, and I just connected deeply at that level. And then I stepped, and I let myself not remember it, but to live in it, because you want it to come from the essence of who you are, And it changed the whole way I told the opening story. It changed everything, and it was transformative. So now a lot of times I'll think in terms of, I almost think of the frequencies as if you're flying at different levels in your talk, and there's times where I have to pull back and go, I need to be a professor right now. There's truth I need to transmit from here to there. And it's not even about motivating them or challenging them or inspire them to great vision. There's just a truth that if I can just transmit this truth, it'll change their life. So there's times I have to pull back and go, it's almost like I need to slow my speedboat and make sure that this professor frequency translates the truth so they don't miss it. So every frequency has has a power that it can bring into your messaging.
Wow. We've talked a lot about communication. Anything we haven't hit on that you want to share?
Oh, wow. This conversation has gone so much further and wider than I expected it to go.
It's great.
And, there's this interesting Princeton study that talked about the role of technology and artificial intelligence in the future, and how every job, every skill set that humans provide will eventually be replaced. But not the transformative power of human communication.
I wondered about that. Yeah.
Yeah. No matter what kind of AI they can create to write copy for you, it will not replace the need for one human being to speak into another human being's life.
I always wondered about that, because who knows where AI is going. But if, everything I'm reading in the next few years is generated by AI or informed by AI, I imagine it's only a matter of time until I have AI that reads what the other AI wrote. So we're not even really communicating anymore. And yet the soul longs to connect with another soul. The human longs to connect with another human. Like, I don't know whether generated versions of this conversation would be the same as a real conversation. It's quite interesting.
Yeah, the future belongs to the communicators. Yeah, and 30 years ago I came here because I believed the future belonged to the creatives.
Now.
And I think the future belongs to the communicators.
Can you say more about that?
Yeah, what we don't realize is the deficit that the human experience has on this planet of having the experience of someone speaking into your soul. Because, you're a person of faith, you go to church, you are a pastor, you have your podcast, you're having all these conversations. You live in the world of human communication. Most people don't. And the reason they're getting trapped into, the internet, and they're getting trapped into gaming is because of this massive deficit of human connection. The people who learn how to speak into people's lives in a way that brings healing and hope, that brings courage and vision, those people are going to be disproportionately leveraged for success in the world. I see this already in the business world. Everybody I know that already has made $100 million is trying to figure out how to become a communicator. They realize, I've made wealth, but what I need to know is I need to learn how to communicate so I can actually bring change. And this is why I think we underestimate the beauty of the church. The greatest musicians in the world came out of the church because every church sang. It's like the greatest art. It's like the church is supposed to be the epicenter of the greatest communicators in the world. But we're entertaining ourselves to death. It's not television and film and, gaming that's actually entertaining ourselves to death. That's not the one I'm worried about. It's the one where on Sunday, we demand pastors to communicate in a way that only speaks to us and is irrelevant to the world. That's the most dangerous kind of entertainment.
Mm-hmm. It's almost like the rump, like those who remain. We're going to stay in our little bunker while the world burns. It's really made me think about the value of communication as well, because you're right. I mean, back to that snippet we had earlier where we talked about, around 2005, our kids didn't need us as much as they used to because the internet went broadband, YouTube was invented, and, all of a sudden you could Google your answers to almost anything. But what you can't really Google satisfactorily is connection, and you can't Google meaning. And I look even at my own newsfeed services and the emails I subscribe to, and sometimes there's so much information, I'm like, I don't know how to digest this. There's just too much. And what I need is someone to come along and speak truth, somebody to speak meaning, someone to make sense of it all. And I don't think that's going away anytime I can see.
No.
Yeah. I love it. The future belongs to communicators. So tell us where they can access your course, because I imagine some would, you're looking like, what's the URL?
Where do I
find
where you can
that?
access my course? Okay, you can go to theartofcommunication.com.
There you go, theartofcommunication.com. And do you have an assessment or anything like that where people could discover it, or is that part of the course?
We have been working on an assessment. We've already finished our first phase, but we're working on a second, third iteration to get it really refined. So there will be an assessment that will come out.
So stay tuned.
Yeah.
Stay tuned.
So it will be available. If you go to theartofcom.org, then it'll be there eventually.
Artofcommunication.org. This is great. Erwin, as always, it's fascinating. Thanks so much for hosting this conversation.
That's great.
Thanks for being on the podcast.
Hey, thank you so much.
There's a new movement happening in the country to reclaim the promise of Jesus' unconditional love and grace, and to see his church rise above the culture war. He Gets Us hopes to give it a voice. The biggest faith campaign in history, He Gets Us invites a rapidly growing audience, from spiritual explorers to like-minded Christians, to reconsider the radical life of Jesus. Whether people believe Jesus was God or just a man, they're invited to consider his example for themselves.